Evening, everyone. Welcome to Unscripted and Unchained, Episode 3. As you can tell by the ticker tape, this is MYFAROG Review. And MYFAROG is mythic fantasy role-playing game. All right. This is currently version 2.6. The most recent version, 2.7, just has some errata for this particular edition. So if you have this edition, this is the book that you're, okay with. No real reason to switch up to 2.7. If you don't have the game, then, you can pick up 2.7 on Amazon for, under $12, which, as far as RPGs go, that's pretty darn cheap to get a physical copy of a book and one that's very decent quality, decent quality paper, decent quality binding, and the game system is actually much better than the reputation that some people have labeled it with. Just to address very briefly the reputation that the game has as far as its game mechanics are concerned is that it is it's very crunchy. There's a lot of rules, a lot of optional rules, and it can be quite cumbersome if you try to use every single rule that the game includes. Now, that actually goes against what the author of the book actually, the game system actually says. And basically he says that, many of these rules are optional, that they're actually labeled as optional. And basically you as the myth master, which is what they call the game masters in this game system, you as the myth master can decide what rules you want to use, and you can generate your own house rules just like any other role-playing game and play it. So this is like I said, the core rule book. And so this is something that's required to play the game. And I would argue this is all that you really need to play the game. I mean, other than dice, obviously, and it uses standard, the gameplay uses standard dice, particularly the D6. Now, other optional booklets that go along with the game is you have these small pamphlets, right? So these are, fairly small pamphlets, and they're, usually less than $5. So you have, I'll do them in somewhat of an order here. So you have Deus Ex Machina, which is a supplemental that gives you some new character class ideas. So this has the Legionnaires character class involved with it, which is kind of like the introduction of the concept of a standing army, which the MYFAROG setting, did not really include in the original. So in the original, the setting of Thule really didn't have the concept of standing armies. And so that's one thing that this booklet here introduces, is the idea of having standing armies, having basically your early knights. And so that's what the Legionnaires stand for. It also includes, systems for coordinated missile attacks, and avatars and sages, which are an expansion of some of the magic system that MYFAROG had. Another book is a booklet is Curses and Gifts, and Curses and Gifts allows some additional flavor for character creation. So this introduces some alignment concepts to it, a character birth date, and the character's birth date actually plays a role in some of their abilities, or their attributes. So they may gain attributes based on it. If they're a if they are a holy man or a what other games would call it, a cleric or a priest, and if they happen to be born in the month of their particular deity or their even on the birthday of their deity, they would gain extra favor with calling upon that deity for help. And that's the other thing that this book does contain, quite a bit with is, advanced religion, intriguing deities, religious differences, curses and gifts, and, some lore on procreation. So that's in this book here. Travels and Treasures is a book that's actually, very good for GMs or myth masters in this case, and so it gives various tables to use for wilderness encounters, the nature of encounters, encounter locations, treasures within the land of Thule, randomly generated treasure items, item types, item quality, and then personal possessions, and then special treasures. One of the things I found so unique about MYFAROG is the currency system doesn't use coins. It uses, in some cases, varying sizes of amber or other semi-precious materials or stones and such. And, that bit of flavor to the game is something that really appealed to me. The magic system in the game is a much more traditional sense of magic. So it's Druidic magic. It's where the magic might be sorcery or might be considered sorcery. It lends itself more towards natural magics anyway. So everything is based on fire or earth or air or water, and where the source of the power comes from. You know, Sorcerers or druids need to have certain components in order to use their skills, and so or to cast their spells, and that was something that really appealed to me, was that that old, a very old or even ancient European concept of magic. And so that's, also in here. Now, there are some other books that, came out earlier on. These were books that came out. So there was the skills, spells and favors, and men and monsters. So this was basically a monster manual. This was always, even at the time when it was MYFAROG 2.4, was just a breakdown of just the skills that were coming out of that rule book anyway. And so this wasn't even necessary then. And then spells and favors, basically the same thing, just a listing of spells and favors. Now, these three older books that were out for 2.4 were incorporated into 2.6. So you no longer need these. Although, I, as a collector, I like to have, a little bit of everything. When Night Falls is the first of the, published adventures for this. So it's basically like an adventure module. Once again, a short adventure, a short booklet, less than 50 pages long. And it's a full-length adventure, though, so it'll probably take you more than one session to run through the whole thing. Unless you're doing an extended session. I think one person recently ran through this in roughly 4 hours. It depends on the pace of your, of the party that's going through it, and, how much role playing they get involved with, and, how smoothly they move through the, through the game system using its various rules, what rules they might actually use. So I haven't actually run it, but I read through it, and it's an enjoyable read. And continuing on that, for enjoyable reads, we have some books that I would consider to be supplementals, and it kind of gives you the flavor of, the fantasy setting of the game. And so there's this is Varge's book on sorcery and religion, all right, in ancient Scandinavia. And so you can see a lot of this, kind of finds its way into MYFAROG. And, that's certainly intentional. Oh, excuse me. Like I said, Unscripted and Unchained. So then there's Reflections on European Mythology and Polytheism. Once again, an extra source if you want to delve a little bit deeper into some of the myths and legends that helped find their way into MYFAROG. And then Varge has been releasing a new series of small pamphlets. This one's Paganism Explained, Part 1. I believe I just saw a post today that Part 2 is now available on Amazon as well, most likely under $5. And that's really, something that I find impressive with this game system, is that, you can get virtually everything that you need for the game for under $35 total. Now, here's another book that I think is really quite important to get, and this is The Coming. And basically, what it does is it takes the fantasy book, or the fantasy setting, and it places it into a modern time frame, a post-apocalyptic time frame. And so what this also introduces, and I think most of us that play this game regularly, we've incorporated it, is that it adds in character flaws. And those character flaws are applicable during any time, any time frame. It doesn't matter when the game setting is actually taking place. It could be, Iron Age, and where MYFAROG really, is kind of set in, or it could be, 2057, or later, and still use those same flaws, because these are basically human and, character flaws. Some of them are mental flaws, and those are universal. They apply throughout any time frame. So what many of us do is we take the flaws that were in this pamphlet, and we apply it to our fantasy characters as well, because they work quite well. But this introduces a whole new setting and new technology, and so on. And I would actually consider this to be a must-have. So of the must-have books, just to make it kind of clear, is the core rule book, MYFAROG 2.6 or 2.7, and then Deus Ex Machina, Curses and Gifts, and Treasures and Travels, especially if you're looking to GM these games, and The Coming if you do want to play in the different setting of the of the world. This is also, I should say, that MYFAROG is set in Thule, which is a mythical fantasy setting, and The Coming is set in our real world, just in a future post-apocalyptic setting. So, continuing on about the game, there's a lot of things, like I said earlier, that really got me, into this game, and one of the very first experiences I had playing it, we were in a group of about 4 or 5 characters, And we were going through what would normally be in another RPG, a fairly routine, combat sequence where we were fighting a group of wolves. And, it really was, a quite dangerous combat. I mean, I think one of our members was practically killed, and, you know, we were kind of really expecting for him to die. Uh, Two other members were seriously injured. We were on the very verge of, breaking away and just cutting and running. And it was that element of danger for characters, even though we were all first level characters, but it was something that you really don't see that often in other role playing games, especially fantasy role playing games. Even though this is closer to what you would call a low fantasy role playing game, you're certainly not going to run that kind of danger playing Dungeons and Dragons, unless you're talking maybe Dungeons and Dragons First Edition. But other than that, I mean, more modern variations of Dungeons and Dragons, I'd say from fourth edition, fifth edition, you're not going to run into a situation like that. If you're comparing it to other games, I'd have to go all the way back to, games like Bushido or Swordbearer to find something that comes kind of close to that kind of element of danger that you're sitting through. And it really does create I think amongst the other players, when we're talking about playing MYFAROG, and when we're playing MYFAROG, and, people will say, oh, well, this is the fifth session of it. And, I'll start thinking, I was like, wow, your characters actually survived through 5 sessions. That's pretty amazing. So you do learn, I think, the idea of, our characters are mortals and they're most likely going to die. I think the only time I've ever experienced a full group wipe in AD&D was the Tomb of Horrors, and maybe one of Ravenloft, the first Ravenloft was a pretty tough experience too. But certainly the Tomb of Horrors, I recall we lost the entire party in Tomb of Horrors, and that was the only module where I had ever seen that happen in that game system. So MYFAROG, I'd say if you go across, if you come across a fairly tough large bear, or I know we encountered a werewolf, and we were kind of encouraged, hinted at to run our asses off, and we managed to do that. So I'm pretty sure that we would have all died if we tried to engage that werewolf. So other materials for the game that I think are quite important. Now, what I did was, I do most of my, I do mostly GMing, and I write all of my own adventures. And so one thing that I found that was useful was to just take the one page, page 19, which is the skills list, and I printed this out separately. And that way I can see, what the list of skills are, what the character classes, that have those particular skills. I found it easier to keep this outside of the book, a copy of it for when I am writing, or if I'm creating a character, it's very useful as well. Now, the website myfarog.org website does give you what's kind of like the Mythmasters screen panels. Although there's actually quite a number of them, but this is the combat sequence and all of this information here. And so it has the round sequence, it has offensive values, defensive values that characters have, and the combat system works where you will take your offensive value and you'll match it up against the defensive value of your opponent, and then you will make your roll. And if your roll covers the differentiation between those two conflicting values, then you've struck your target, and then you roll for damage, and you check conditions, and so on, and you see if you've caused cuts and stuns and bleeds and so on. So there are a lot of rules. Many of them are optional, and I for instance, like they have a morale check. That's the very first thing that you do, and I actually move the morale check to later on in the sequence after the first round of combat has taken place, and then I felt that that's a better place to have morale, to test to see if you've broken after you've actually engaged in some combat. They have other things in this, in the DM's packet. I'm going to keep on calling it GM or DM's packet. It's really the Myth Masters packet. So all the weapon stats, all of the, all the weapon stats for melee weapons, for missile weapons. There's navigation tool rules, there's tracking rules and such. There's wind and weather. Like I said, many of the things. Now, I'm going to say this about the wind and weather. This is one of the things that was specifically criticized with, what's the difference between a light air and a light breeze, and a gentle breeze and a moderate breeze, and fresh breeze and strong breeze. And, they have all the different, wind speed differences between each of those and such. You go all the way up to hurricane, or a storm, or a whole gale versus a strong gale. Now, when you first read about these, and you start thinking about these, and to think of using these actually during gameplay, I can see why people would say, well, that's not that's not something that I just have to hold on one second. There we go. My screen went into a black screen. But I can understand why people will look at this and say, you're going to sit there and do that. Probably not. But what I did with that system is that I was actually making one of my own adventures. And one of my own adventures, which I will eventually put out there online, is Fair Winds and Bloody Shores. Is an adventure that I made. And what I did was, while looking at that system of, the winds and where they're coming from, and what effect that they had, I actually used them to set into the travel portion of the adventure, where the characters were on a ship, and they were trying to get to a certain location at a certain time, and if they didn't get there at a certain time, various other events would come into play. And I actually rolled out, a total of 6 of those wind changes, or the possibility of those wind changes, and then 2 additional encounters, for each of those potential, shifts. So, there was, a total of 12 different encounters that I built into using it. And when it was all said and done, and I really did keep it as random as possible with the, all right, this is the weather pattern that I got. This is the wind direction and the wind speed that I got when I made the roll. And then how would that affect, it really did become a core part of that portion of the adventure's storytelling. And so, when certain of these rules have been criticized in the past, it's like, well, nothing says that you have to use them right then and there. They can be part of your planning process, and that's what I felt. Some of these rules really did shine because of that, and it does make it, very unique as, an experience of writing, an adventure, and in the experience of actually playing them out, because the characters, the players were actually experiencing these particular changes in their events. And then when I went back and I explained to them, you know what, I actually used that system, they were like, wow, that's really cool. That's how that really plays out in the game. So if I had them sitting there rolling through it, they might have had a very different experience. Some of the other things that that are provided on the website is they do have the world map, and the world map is then broken down into its individual regions. All right, and so this is one particular region, and then what I did was I just pulled all of the information about the region, and just made a copy out of the core book, and I'm basically putting together what I would consider to be like an atlas of, each individual region, and when it's all said and done. So I have, I switched to the wrong page, but so what I did was I just broke down the region. And so I now have a clear write-up of the region, and I started fleshing it out. I started adding notable personalities, notable NPCs and towns, and really just starting to make the base setting my own campaign setting. So that's another thing. It's a little bit, it's obviously extra work to do, and it's one thing I've been, hoping that MYFAROG does put out is that they take a lot of the information that I would consider to be like an atlas type information and pull it out of the core rule book and put it into its own little pamphlet, which I guarantee would sell very well, almost like hotcakes. For it, because it would be a useful resource to have on the side, especially for writing your own adventures. So if you haven't played this game before, I strongly suggest it. When I first got turned on to the game, I was turned on to the game from some negative press that it was receiving, and I've always been the kind of person that I like to see something for myself, and when before I make a judgment on it, before I say, well, I'm not going to try it, or I'm not going to, I'll take a look at it initially. And I started looking at it, and I was like, hey, when I saw that the entire rule system was under $12, I was like, for me, it's worth it to look at a new game system, at $10, $12, and just to check it out. And I'm certainly glad that the negative press kind of had a backfire effect, certainly with me. And I got turned on to a game system that really did bring me back into pen and paper, or tabletop role-playing games, because I had been absent from them for, quite a long time, probably close to, 15, 20-year absence from pen and paper role-playing games. And I was almost exclusively from, the 1990s and 2000s and computer gaming, and then the 2000s and forward, mostly massively multiplayer online games, so MMOs basically were my whole experience, up until about 2015. So once again, if you've never tried the game, I suggest you purchase the rule book, $12 on Amazon, and give the game a try, because it certainly is a unique experience, and something that don't allow the judgments of others taint you, and move you away from a game that really is a much better system than many people give it credit for. So I hope you enjoyed this session of Unscripted and Unchained, and I'm looking forward to putting up some other videos of some gameplay, and for both MYFAROG and for some of my other gaming interests. So you all have a good weekend.